what we're doing. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And today, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Inshallah, today is going to be the first day for our course, and it's called Pearls of the Prophet ﷺ. And what it's about, it's really going to go in certain details in where it's going to take the hadith on a certain subject. Let's say the most important hadith related to a certain subject, and we're basically going to focus on that, go into explaining those hadith, and then try as much as we can to kind of learn about the hadith, the subjects that it's, or at least the topics that it's trying to teach us, and two, of course, the narration, just a little bit. We're not going to go into too much detail about the narration, but what I really wanted to focus in where just focus on a particular topic, take those ahadith, those couple ahadith, get them translated, kind of like what we would do in tafsir, and take one set of ahadith at a time regarding different topics. So here we go. The first thing, of course, we're really going to be just familiarizing familiar okay, here we go, you guys understand, students with basically the sciences of hadith. We're not going to go in details with that because you took it in hadith class, but I will just give you kind of like a summary for that. We'll go into selected ahadith, their historical and theological context. We'll also explore practical applications for these ahadith and how we would apply them. And we would basically encourage like critical thinking, personal reflection, and perhaps, at the end of every class, you can decide if you would want to participate and actually say, and you would also be the teacher. What would you like to teach us? What does this hadith give you? Your own reflection within, I guess, the hadith. And of course, I am open, of course, with, open with everyone to join the class. And inshallah, we would be happy if you would also register for the class as well on gemsoflight.org. And inshallah, even if you have any trouble signing up, don't worry. Noura is always, inshallah, ya Rabbi, there to help us fix the situation. All right. Just an overview. I mean, in regarding the science of hadith, we'll talk about that for a bit, but just to let you see what a hadith we're going to be working on. So we're going to talk about things related to niyyah. But what we want to see in this hadith class, I don't want to make it like it's a subject in where we're taking the subject and we're going to talk about it in where it's going to be boring. But no, we're doing tafsir. And of course, in tafsir, we're basically trying to take a set of ayat and, of course, letting those ayat tell us how we could see the application within our life. So it's redirecting our focus. So the topics that I chose in terms of a hadith, one, the intention, two, the importance of brotherhood, three, seeking knowledge, and of course, this how this method of seeking knowledge is related to our spirituality and our deen, and certainly relationship with ethics, living the ethics, living the akhlaq. What does it really mean? How do we embrace all of that? And of course, with the other set, in where how do we actually live a rifq? How do we live the compassion? How do we live mercy? How do we embrace ourselves? Of course, with the Prophet ﷺ and see what he was teaching us in regards to these different akhlaq. Certain things about prayer, about our relationship, what was the Prophet ﷺ really teaching us? You know, what we're really trying to do, we're trying to live as if the Prophet ﷺ is around us and talking to us. We just want to listen and just take those words, listen to them, and just imagine that he was talking to us and giving us these words and giving us how do we actually apply the words of the Quran. I guess sometimes we would read the ayat, and then when we get to, I guess, hear the ayat so many times, sometimes we would start listening to the ayat with our mind and not necessarily with our hearts. So the Prophet ﷺ, his words are basically going to speak to us on how to let those ayat speak to our hearts, how we can let those ayat reflect it in our basically akhlaq, in our mannerisms in action. So that's why we need to spend some time to really listen to what the Prophet ﷺ is going to say in regards to that. Now, another thing, there will be some, let's say, group presentations where there will be, of course, the students, they'll present insights on the ahadith. So after every class, inshallah, or at least during class, at the end, prepare yourself for those that want to. I'm not going to randomly select you. So for those that would like to say something, that's absolutely fine to say, here's what I learned, here's what I would like to share, etc. That's absolutely fine. And of course, we will be putting in more topics, but I left the other topics for you to choose down the road. Let me show you some of those hadith and what that actually looks like. All right, I'm going to show you how, and I'll be sending you those hadith. I'll be sending you those hadith, and where is it? Is this it? No, hold on. Let me find it. And I'll be sending you those hadith, and in order for you to actually see it. It's so weird. It's not actually coming out. Oh, here. This is it. Okay. Yes, it is coming up. Are you able to see it? No, you're not. Hold on. All right. Here we go. So you can see we'll be taking, look at this. We'll be getting a hadith and it's translated. And of course, relating to a certain topic, redirecting our vision, for example, redirecting our intention. And we'll take one hadith at a time, talk about it. Now, someone's asking, are we going to memorize those hadith? If you're able to memorize it, that'll be great. If you're not able to memorize but one hadith, that's perfect. You want to memorize all of them, that's outstanding. So you see, because I can understand that not everyone has the, I guess, the effort, the ability, the time, etc. But challenge yourself. Let's say it that way. I don't want to ask you to challenge others. I understand that each one, you've got your own circumstances that are different from someone else, but I would say challenge yourself, even if you say, well, I'll just memorize the shortest hadith out of all of them. That's absolutely fine. Or maybe someone can say, no, I can memorize even more. I can memorize maybe all the hadith. That would be great. So you could see we're taking the different hadith and going into details in regards to explaining those hadith. I'm really excited because, when you speak about one topic, of course, if you were to memorize all those hadith, you will be capable of making pretty much the foundation for a particular topic in Islam. Like, let's say niyyah, you'll have just by having 10 hadith right there, or 7 hadith. Make it like you're going to memorize 1 hadith per day. All right. If you memorize, here we go, 7 per week. Well, that'll be great. You'll be capable of recognizing 7 different quotes for the Prophet. That would be great. I'll also get some famous quotes for different salihin that had, I guess, reflected on the hadiths and what their take and what they would tell us in regards to understanding those hadith. So here we go, some of those things. And I'll explain who these people are, right? I'll explain who these people are and how they actually applied it and some of the lessons learned. I mean, you can add some lessons learned. It doesn't have to be just within that. And inshallah, we will talk about it in details. And of course, even if you wanted to ask questions related to those ahadith, at least the fiqh of it, that's also absolutely fine. You can put your questions in the chat, or you can even unmute yourself and say, hey, I'd like to talk about and ask the question. That's absolutely fine as well. I guess just give me hands up in or thumbs up. I don't know. Is it a hands up, thumbs up in, I guess, on Zoom, just so that I would, I guess, complete the sentences and kind of get a good communication right there. All right. So before we start, I did actually have a number of different resources on the science of hadith. I'm going to go back to this one in where, let's say, the overview of hadith. I did actually have, let's see, right there, recommended books to read. And let's say, Introduction to the Science of Hadith, Yasser al-Qadi, 40 Hadith. Well, the 40 Hadith, I do have the 40 Hadith. It was actually done in a whole series, the 40 Nawawi Hadith, even though it's actually 42. I do actually have that on YouTube, but that's not necessarily directly related to here. Introduction to the Science of Hadith, it's really strange how this book is the same as this book, but this is a much better translation, but this is a lot easier to read. Okay, or no, this one and this one, sorry. This one and this one, they're basically the same. But this is more of a technical book. In other words, this is going into certain details about the science of hadith and not necessarily into the hadith that we're studying. The hadith that we're studying, I basically went to the different topics and looked at the most important ahadith that are relevant to the topic. And I tried as much as I can to choose the authentic ahadith because I didn't want to choose non-authentic ahadith and then, of course, get into the conversations into, well, this is not authentic, and then get ourselves confused with which one is authentic and which one is not. So I was basically wanting to just focus on the authentic hadith that are related to the topics that we're studying. So you're going to see a lot of Sahih Muslim, Sahih Bukhari, because just making it easy, and rather than, trying to confuse ourselves in where if it's not authentic hadith, so let's just skip it. There's plenty out there that are authentic, and we could basically use that as a resource. But at the same time, I wanted to give you some references on books of hadith in order to understand when we say this hadith is narrated by Bukhari and Muslim, or this hadith is authentic, or this hadith is not authentic, what does that actually mean? So those are some of the books that basically did a good job in explaining the science of hadith. So you could say that. For those that would like to take a test, for those that would, yesterday, Noura was telling me it's not a good idea to do a comprehensive test. So she basically suggested that we would do kind of like a weekly thing, or let's say once we would pass a number of different categories, we could just make kind of like a three interval tests, and where instead of making it one test, we'll make it into test one, test two, test three. That is, if you would like to get tested and you would like to get a degree for it. If you're taking the class, I would really recommend just test yourself, just see where you're at, study that, take some notes, and there's going to be a recording, so that's going to be passed out as well. And for those that would like the material, and would like to get the material, whether it's the reading material or whether it's other syllabus and all the other things that we'll be sharing, that will be sent on Teams. It's basically a program. Well, on the Gems of Light website, there is the register. You could register for the class, and then you'll get an email giving you all the information on how to log in, how to get that information on, for joining the teams. Our class, at least my class, will only be on Zoom, but the other teachers are actually using Teams, and they'll also be doing, the different programs. Absolutely recommend them. They're very competent. They're great scholars. They're actually head of departments, whether it's Dr. Samia Harb has an قراءات الإجازة in 10 قراءات, and was a professor in Jordanian University, and mashallah, one of the best teachers. Same thing with Dr. Muna Rifat. She was the head of department in Taiba University, in Najah University, very competent and very, mashallah, good in her akhlaq. I attest to that. So please, you would really benefit from those beacons. Alia was as well, Stada Alia, also, mashallah, very good, very committed and very compassionate, very good, mashallah, even in her mashallah, in education, her commitment. You would really love those classes. So definitely join. And even if you don't get tested, and even if you just don't like tests, some people are just have an allergy to tests. They start getting anaphylaxis, which is completely understandable. So for those that don't want to get tested and don't want to join the test, but they would like to join the classes, that's also okay too. And for those that that want to join the classes and don't have, let's say, the financial capabilities to join, just get I guess that mukhlisin financial aid, and donate whatever you can, even if it's $5, even if it's 3.50, whatever, and inshallah Rabbil Alameen will put barakah in that. So let us start, inshallah. What is a hadith, and what do we mean by a hadith, and where did these come from? So in general, we're just going to make this really quick. In general, when we're speaking about hadith, hadith is basically, let's write that down, right? Let's write that down, and we're going to take those notes during class, and that way you could actually see it. So let's look at that, look at it right there, and we're going to share another screen, and we're going to be taking those notes. Okay, here we go. All right. So what's a hadith? So a hadith in general, and sometimes I would write in Arabic, don't panic. I will translate it, okay? Don't panic. All right, here we go. Just going to give you the word hadith actually comes from hadatha, but the word hadatha actually means to happen. the word hadith actually comes from in where tahaddatha, haddatha, in where spoken. So when you look at hadith, it basically means, here's the technical term, in where ما صدر عن الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم من قول أو فعل أو تقرير أو صفة. Don't worry, I know that sounds Chinese to you. So what does that mean? Anything that was one mentioned by the Prophet ﷺ, so whether it was mentioned by the Prophet ﷺ or an action that he had done, all right, or a report of the Prophet ﷺ, any report, and we'll talk about each and every single one and what that means, or a description. So what does that mean? So when you talk about a quote, something mentioned that is going to be a quote, all right, and this quote is basically mentioned by the Prophet ﷺ. Now, the quote and what the wording is, in where we would look into who said it, how they said it, their qualification and so forth. But we're just looking at the hadith itself or an action. So a Sahabi could tell us that the Prophet ﷺ had basically sat, he got up, he wiped his hand, he put his let's say his, I don't know, his stick, he did this. That's all also considered a hadith or a description that the Prophet ﷺ had a certain like a mole or a birthmark at the back of his neck, just different descriptions about the Prophet ﷺ. Now, that's a general thing in where it's different than sunnah. So sunnah basically has different meanings. The sunnah, it can mean hadith. In other words, it can be a synonym for hadith. It can mean exactly the same thing in where they're referring to hadith. Okay, so sunnah can mean hadith. Sunnah could also mean recommended. In other words, recommended by uh, by looking at the words. It's giving me an indication that it's not obligatory, but recommended by the Prophet ﷺ. Sunnah can also mean, of course, literally, in where what it means path. It means habit. All right. So you've got a certain habit. That's basically what your sunnah is. You, every single day, the first thing you wake up in the morning, I don't know, drink some water, go to the bathroom, brush your teeth, comb your hair, get yourself ready. This is basically your sunnah. As sunnah could also mean only, we're speaking about only the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, basically just the seerah. So we're looking at seerah on, well, it would, sorry, let me use this one. It would include seerah. What is seerah? So seerah means the biography of the Prophet ﷺ. The biography of the Prophet ﷺ, in where the history of the Prophet ﷺ, history of Islam, basically, history of Islam, at least until 11-year hijrah, because the Prophet ﷺ died 11-year hijrah. Okay, so that would be including everything about the biography. So now you could see that the word sunnah can sometimes be a synonym to mean hadith. Now, not everything that is mentioned as a quote, let's say instead of use the word mention, let's use the word quote. All right. Now, not everything that was a quote or an action or a report or a description, we would necessarily just take it as authentic. So That's where the different scholars of hadith, they basically came in and thought, no, we not just because someone said that the Prophet ﷺ had said something or had done something, or there was a report or a description, we cannot necessarily just accept their words to being authentic. We need referencing. We need to make sure that this was really authentic. So, how do we prove whether something is authentic or not? Well, we need to actually make sure that there is a chain of narration. So, we're going to look at the people, all right, in where, in order for it to be sahih, or let's say authentic, in order for that hadith to be authentic, then there's a certain definition for an authentic hadith. What is that definition? ما العدل let's see العدل الضابط إلى منتهاه من غير شذوذ ولا علة قادحة. What does that mean? ما نقله العدل الضابط عن العدل الضابط إلى منتهى من غير شذوذ ولا علة قادحة. So what does that mean? Well, I've got a chain of narration, and what that means, every single person is going to basically undergo a very detailed and a specific scrutiny. This scrutiny is going to search for the following. Al-Adl. What is Al-Adl? Al-Adl, we're basically going to look into the person's piety. We're going to scrutinize the religiosity. Yes, we're going to be critical. We're going to make sure that this person has the piety to really report, to really pass on the science, the ilm of the Prophet ﷺ, and make sure that they're not putting in their own interpretation, thinking that they're doing Islam a favor, or thinking that by presenting this, that somehow that they are basically the ones that are wanting to be in the spotlight and so forth. No, we need to search their piety and make sure that they're people of religion. Two, we also need to, that's not enough. Imam Malik used to say there were 70 people in Medina, and where even if they were to make dua and ask for rain, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would answer their dua for making the dua for rain. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would basically judge and look at their iman, but their ability to perhaps pass on a hadith, transmit a hadith, they're not necessarily competent and qualified enough. So that's where we would look at their memory just to make sure that they are basically competent enough to pass on the information, their ability to quote, and so forth. Now, that's not only in one person, but that's each and every single person within the chain of narration. Now, the chain of narration, of course, every single person is considered a scholar himself. They would be scholars that passed it on to scholars that passed it on to scholars, and it becomes something that was, let's say, passed on from one person to another just by seeing. Let me give you an idea. So let's actually do that in number and kind of see that in drawing, okay? So let's just assume we have this person. This person is basically transmitting it to, let's say, 5 people. These 5 people are basically going to pass it on to another 10 people. And of course, later on, this person is going to be passing it on to even more people. So what would happen? Let's see. He'll pass it on to more people. Now, here's one thing. By looking at this, let's just get another color just so that we could see it. And where, let me do something smaller. So by looking at these, therefore, you've got the main figure is right there. But guess what? Let's say we have one chain of narration in where it goes this way. So I've got, let's just say this is right there, Ayan. Ayan basically quoted off Nisreen, and Nisreen quoted off Sana, and then Sana quoted off Rihab. But let's assume we were more than that, because we're talking about here, we assume that there were 10 people right there. So when you're looking at these narrations, think of them as numbers right there, in where if we had this chain of narration and certainly it was one quote, then we would basically have to have, if it's one quote, then we would definitely have different quotes in different connections. And these connections are not supposed to be contradicting one another, because I've got this path, I've got this path, I've got this path, and definitely more and more paths. So if the ones that are transmitting the hadith all the way to the Prophet ﷺ, if they were really authentic, you would see that it's impossible for them to contradict themselves. But it can happen that one particular figure, we basically saw scholars of hadith, they were capable of picking up who really was the problem within these chain of narrations, in where whenever they would appear in a chain of narration, they were capable of seeing that there was some mistake, some confusion, some wrong wording for certain hadith, and therefore we would see that they would be picked up and, I guess, exposed to not necessarily being authentic narrators. So therefore, we would look into each and every single person within the chain of narration to make sure that there's no contradiction. So no contradiction, or even discrepancies with what was mentioned. And certainly we would also search all the different scholars, because we would also have huge profiles in the books of hadith. So if you learn the science of hadith, you'll basically learn two masarat. What is that? There's one route in where you're learning the chains of narration, you're learning how to differentiate an authentic hadith from a non-authentic hadith, from a fabricated hadith, and so forth. Or you're also learning another thing, which basically is the hadith itself, in where what is actually called matan. The matan is basically the actual wording in where what the hadith really contains. What you're learning in profiles, you're basically learning something called a sanad. What is a sanad? It's basically the chain of narration. The chain of narration. And the chain of narration is not necessarily when we would say narrated by Abu Dawood, narrated by Tirmidhi. No, those were the scholars that managed to, let's say, find those hadith. They were traveling, and by traveling, in order to get to the narrators and basically take that quote and say, well, can you tell me who your narrators are? And they'll basically say their narrators. He'll put it down. Some of the scholars, they managed to basically research each and every single one and only put a hadith that are authentic within their books, just like Sahih Muslim, for example, but you've got other scholars of hadith. No, they will basically put the ahadith without necessarily being committed to authentic alone, and they'll basically cover all the different ahadiths that they were capable of collecting and included in their book. So just a note, and just so that we could see how and what this actually looks like. Now, when we study il-matan, it's actually harder than studying a sanad. And studying il-matan, in where you would see scholars that are specialized in il-ilal, the specialty of al-ilal, that's probably the most sophisticated science in hadith, because in order to be at that level, you really have to memorize chains after chains of narrations and actually see where they intersect, where they basically connect, which one out of all these chain of narrations is basically confusing the different mutun, and so forth. So this is just an idea of just the books of sunnah or the books of hadith. Now, one thing is that, well, if we have an authentic hadith, what are the other options? The other options, other than authentic hadith, we've got number one is basically called a hadith that is hasan. What is a hadith that is hasan? So when we said that an authentic hadith has these right there, these things that we would take in consideration. Well, a Hasan hadith has one thing that is wrong. Let's say we're going to take this and we're going to do it right there, and we're going to say might have, that's it, might have poor memory, might have poor memory, and might be less competent than the other narrators. So therefore, just realizing that al-hadith al-hasan would basically be a second stage after hadith sahih. After hadith sahih, that, of course, that poor memory, if we're capable of going to other books of hadith that manage to get the chain of narration, we'll still consider it hasan, but we would look into how authentic is that hadith in terms of matan. The other classification is basically called da'if. The word da'if actually means weak. So when we're speaking about weak hadiths, we're either talking about, let's write it right there, we're either talking about poor in their deen, and well, we already know what a hadith hasan is, or they could be having bad memory, and every single person, in where we might have certain persons or certain figures within the hadith, certain figures within the hadith, basically not known perhaps, or maybe this person was known to not necessarily mention the hadith in an authentic way. There's some contradiction, some discrepancy with other narrators. Then in that situation, just keeping in mind that this is what we would consider as weak ahadith, because in Islam, we're supposed to be making sure that when we learn our deen, we learn from those that are qualified. We don't just blindly take whoever is speaking, but we make sure that this person is qualified. So you've got number one, you've got Sahih hadith where all the conditions are met. Number two, you've got a Hasan hadith in where the person has a poor memory and in wording. Da'if hadith, they could be poor in their deen, they could be bad in their memory, they could have certain figures in where are not necessarily all on the same page, or sometimes containing some discrepancy, some contradiction with what was basically mentioned from previous or other more authentic scholars. So that's one thing to mention. Are there a number of different ahadith? So there were many ahadith, and even the weak ahadith, they would still mention them even though they are weak. But that's on a condition that we would recognize that a scholar named As-Suyuti, he basically As-Suyuti basically classified ahadith in part of the classification in where there are 69 different types of non-authentic hadith. All right, 69 different types. So what does that mean? Not all the 69 types we would necessarily reject it. If it's extremely weak, where we've got somebody that is probably poor in their deen, what does that mean? So for example, they could have judged somebody being poor in their deen because they saw them eating a sandwich on the street. They said that's basically من خوارم المروءة. So they said, yes, ما نقله العدل الضابط على عدل ضابط إلى منتهى من غير شذوذ ولا علة قادحة. And for the person, in order to basically be considered as a person of authenticity or a person that is of a qualification, we need to make sure that every single person is that. Plus, there is no muru'a qadiha. What is that? So we're not just looking at the actual wording alone. That's one side. We're also making sure that they're also connected. That is the people of narration. Number three, we're not only looking at connection, but we're also speaking about in where the person himself is basically understanding what he's saying, even if the person perhaps taking the hadith might actually be wiser, smarter than the person that heard the hadith. So just keeping that one in mind, where the actual wording connection is there, and certainly the person does not have any khawarim al-muru'ah. What does that mean? What does it mean that they might have khawarim al-muru'ah? Khawarim al-muru'ah is more based on culture. So if within that culture they were practicing certain practices, but it is only practiced by perhaps people that are deviant, okay? So in that situation, that person lacks muru'ah. I'm going to give you a break because we're going to get into the ahadith. Okay, I'll give you like a minute or two break and we'll continue, inshallah. Okay, so assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So what we were just basically covering up in where when we're looking at hadith, we said that there is one a specific definition for hadith, and hadith would be what was mentioned upon the Prophet ﷺ, whether it was a quote, an action, a report, and we said the word hadith could also mean sunnah, but of course, sunnah could also mean hadith as well, but not every time we say the word sunnah that it means hadith. It depends on the context, it depends on the science in where the word sunnah can mean path, can mean seerah, or the biography of the Prophet ﷺ, or can also mean recommended. And of course, in terms of the classification of how authentic such a hadith is, and we would look into number one, we would look into the two different routes. We would look into the chain of narration, we would also look at the matan. Let's look at it. We'll study the chain of narration. That's one side. And the second thing, we'll basically study what is called the al-matan. Al-matan is the actual wording. The chain of narration are basically the persons, the different persons that basically are narrating those hadith. Those ahadith that are narrating those hadiths. So we're studying each and every single one. Now, there are profiles in where they basically had all the different details of each and every single narrator, and also tell us whether they are qualified or whether they are having piety, memory, and whether they had met, and that's why they'll have rawan, fulan. They'll basically say who they narrated off of, who their scholars are, who basically was meeting with him, where he lived, where he died. Why do some scholars basically consider him weak or not weak, etc.? So they will basically go in terms of details to see whether this person is qualified to say what he's saying. All right. And let's see, we'll also talk about, inshallah, just keeping in mind that al-hadith al-da'ifa, not every single hadith that is da'if, we would necessarily leave it. Sometimes some hadith can be weak, but we would still use them in fiqh, or we would still apply them because they're not extremely weak. What does it mean to be extremely weak? Keeping in mind, there are 69 different types of non-authentic hadith. What does that mean? So when you're looking at different types of weak hadith, it could be related to the person. It could be related to the person in terms of, well, they had perhaps the person wasn't the best in their deen, but it wasn't something major. It could be that, for example, they didn't believe in certain things related to qadar. They had a wrong belief in qadar, or they had a wrong belief in a certain interpretation about the religion. For example, they had probably some kind of a tashayyu', some kind of a Shi'ism right there. Do we necessarily reject them? The answer is no. We would look into the reason, and then the reason, there's a certain classification, and this classification is going to determine which ahadith are basically to be taken and which ahadith are to be rejected and simply considered as mawdu'a. What is that? Mawdu'a actually means fabricated ahadith. Which of these are fabricated? And therefore, one cannot quote. It would be haram to even quote those ahadith. All right, so this was right there a summary. Where do we get these ahadith from? So there are different books of hadiths. the different books of hadiths, there are different scholars that basically worked and traveled hard in order to combine these ahadith. They would interview the people, they would basically make a certain study on this person, they would travel to get one hadith quoted because someone else had quoted off the Prophet ﷺ and off the Sahaba and so forth. So you have different scholars that had collected those hadiths. So whether it's Sahih Bukhari, Muslim, Tirmidhi, Abu Dawood, Ahmad, Malik, and the list goes on and on. And then you had other scholars later, they basically had not necessarily a smaller chain. And of course, the smaller the chain of narration, the better. Because the more you have, the more people you have between you and the Prophet ﷺ, that means it took longer years, that means longer times. It wasn't basically as direct. So you have some of the shortest chains of narration are just 3 people apart, where it's the father, the grandson narrating off his father, and the father narrating off the grandfather, basically, just 3 different people. All right, so those hadith that we're going to be looking into right now, inshallah, we're going to talk about the following hadiths. We're going to get to the hadith that we're going to be studying, inshallah. But before we start, I'm sure there's a question. Go ahead, my dear Rihab.
Yes, Sheikha, I wanted to know when were the ahadith first collected, like the first time?
So you had different reports say that one, Abu Huraira was writing certain ahadith and repeating certain ahadith. You want to keep in mind what a hadith is. It's basically a quote of the Prophet ﷺ that the Sahaba themselves, they had lived around the Prophet ﷺ, so they basically heard him speak. They basically had seen him do certain things, and the Sahaba would pass it on to the rest of the people, and the rest of the people would pass it on to the rest of the people, and so forth. So it was not al-Bukhari. No, Imam Malik actually collected al-Muwatta. So you had that. There were other, let's say, smaller collections. We don't necessarily have all of them, but of course, we don't have a hadith that are missing out. They're actually available. So you had, it was more common in the 3rd century, 3rd and mid-2nd century. That's when most of the hadith were basically collected. But there were before, because you want to keep in mind that Imam Malik died 179 Hijriya. So if you subtract that from 11, so we're speaking about between Imam Malik was 168 years between him and the Prophet ﷺ. All right, and Imam Malik wasn't the first. Imam Malik wasn't the first. We had different notes of who really was the first, but there were debates in that, so I'm not going to go into that. But Imam Malik was perhaps the known, and in where we have his book already there, and it is published until the time of today. In his book Al-Muwatta. Any other question, dear?
Barakallahu.
Wafik. All right, so now we're going to get into the ahadith, and let's take it one hadith at a time, inshallah. The first one, of course, when we're learning hadiths, whenever you would go to the books of hadith, always, the first chapter is going to be in regards to intention. In fact, it is so serious that it would take us to really into that realization that a hadith can actually flip even a good deed that you are doing into a bad deed, but the action is the same. How did it even change? It's the same, but the intention is basically going to be altering the whole game right there. It could be for your favor or against your favor. So the Prophet ﷺ was teaching the Sahaba that it is critical to look at the intention for the following reasons. Let's sit and listen to the different quotes. Not going to be going in so much detail. Let's see. The Prophet ﷺ, Abu Huraira. There are actually a number of different narrators that narrated the exact same quote. That the Prophet ﷺ, قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم, إنما الأعمال بالنيات وإنه لكل امرئ ما نوى فمن كانت هجرته إلى الله ورسوله فهجرته إلى الله ورسوله ومن كانت هجرته لدنيا يصيبها أو امرأة ينكحها فهجرته إلى ما هاجر إليه. You could see this is called رواه البخاري ومسلم. Another term for it is basically called متفق عليه. When you see متفق عليه, that would actually mean that it is narrated by Bukhari and Muslim. Abu Huraira quotes off the Prophet ﷺ that the messenger had said, actions are judged by intentions. Whoever migrates for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his messenger, then his migration is for Allah and his messenger. Whoever migrates for worldly gain or to marry a woman, then his migration is for what he migrated for. Okay, a couple things. إنما الأعمال بالنيات. When you say verily, all the actions are dependent on the intention. In other words, even if the action is good, we would basically see that what's going to determine whether it's good or not, or even if it's a good, if it's a good action, if the intention is wrong, then in that situation, that action becomes a wrong action, and the person would not actually get rewarded for it. وَإِنَّهُ لِكُلِّ امْرِئٍ مَا نَوَى. And or there is another narration, وَإِنَّمَا لِكُلِّ امْرِئٍ مَا نَوَى. The word innama and verily, whatever the person had intended good for, they would basically get the good intention, the good reward for it. But if the person had intended another intention, in other words, an evil intention, then in that situation, it would the good action be dismissed alone, but it would also affect the deed in where the person will get in return to having the wrong intention would not actually get rewarded for it. Now, here's the thing. فَمَنْ كَانَتْ هِجْرَتُهُ إِلَى اللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ. Whoever is migrating for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and in that situation, they would get the reward as a person that migrated for the sake of Allah and His Prophet. And whoever is migrating for a woman to get married to, well, how is that relevant to anything? Who brought up anybody getting married? Yes, there is a story. The story was there was a guy, his name was Muhajir Qais. Muhajir Qais. So this guy was basically Muslim, but he wasn't living in Mecca. And the Prophet ﷺ, at one point before 8-year hijrah, before the conquest of Mecca, every single Muslim in this world was supposed to be going to Medina to create a union. in Medina. But not everyone had the capacity and the ability to basically do the traveling. Muhajir Qais, he was in love with this woman, Qais, who was living in Medina. But this man migrated to Medina not necessarily because he wanted to be around the Prophet ﷺ, but because he was in love with Qais. So the Sahaba, they went to the Prophet ﷺ and said, well, he migrated to get married to Qais. Does he get a reward for this? So the Prophet ﷺ said, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. Your actions are based on your intentions. In other words, your intention is going to determine a lot of what your action really is displaying. Is it displaying an act of good deed, or is it displaying an act of an evil deed? Let's look at hadith number 2. The Prophet ﷺ, hadith Jabir ibn Abdullah. Jabir ibn Abdullah, let me first talk about Abu Huraira. Abu Huraira, his name is Abdul Rahman ibn Sakhr. Abdul Rahman ibn Sakhr. That's an easy name to remember. Abdul Rahman ibn Sakhr, or Abu Huraira, he didn't actually become Muslim as well early, because Abu Huraira basically was Dawsi. What does that mean? So Dawsi is going to be that he was from the areas that were basically considered part of Yemen. So I want you to look in here. I'm going to share another screen. Sometimes we'll look into different narrators. Let's look at that. And where this is Abu Huraira, and you could see that this is really nice in where they gave you the reference. So this is going to be our favorite reference. It's basically called Siyar A'lam al-Nubala, the biography of the honorable ones. For who? For Dhahabi. His name is Shamsuddin Muhammad ibn Ahmad ibn Uthman al-Dhahabi. Shamsuddin was not his name. Shamsuddin was a nickname. During that time, they used to use things like Shamsuddin, Alauddin, Amaruddin, Izzuddin. Those were nicknames. They're actual nicknames of actual names. So if your name was Yusuf, it's going to be Salahuddin. If your name was Muhammad, it was going to be Shamsuddin. If your name was Ahmad, it was going to be Nuruddin. If your name is Mas'ud, it would be Izzuddin. You see it right there? So what about ladies? Did they have Star of Ad-Din perhaps? No, that wasn't common to actually use it for women. So Shamsuddin, his name is Muhammad ibn Ahmad al-Dhahabi. We're talking about Dhahabi in Siyar A'lam al-Nubala is basically a huge 21 volume book, and definitely one of my favorite, because what he does, he basically combines the most important figures throughout history based on his time. He died in 700 and perhaps 700 and something Hijrah. So basically just before him, because definitely he's not going to be writing something in the future. So let's see, this is Abu Huraira, and he calls him Al-Imam, Al-Faqih, Al-Mujtahid, Al-Hafiz, صاحب رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم, Abu Huraira Ad-Dawsi Al-Yamani. So therefore, he was from Yemen, and he called him Faqih, Mujtahid, and Hafiz. Those are each and every single one. Imagine if we're going to use like a PhD, master's, and professor, or etc. So this would be, at the time, Imam would basically be a scholar on a specific, in other words, master. Think of him as a professor for a department in where he is basically an imam, a leading scholar within that field. Al-faqih, not every imam is going to be faqih. Al-faqih is going to be a scholar of Islamic jurisprudence. Al-mujtahid is basically a person that is capable of deriving rulings, and because he is scholarly, so he's basically going beyond the, let's say, the level of other scholars. Al-Hafiz, and Al-Hafiz memorized. In other words, Al-Hafiz means the person is basically completing his memorization. And what we're talking about in terms of memorization of Quran, memorizing of ahadith, memorizing, of course, ilm itself. And Abu Huraira is from Yemen. So let's just keep in that. In where was his name Abdurrahman ibn Sakhr, or is it Ibn Ghanam, or is it right there Abdu Shams, because that was his name before. His name before was Abdu Shams, but then the Prophet ﷺ flipped his name because his name actually means kufr. Okay, so this is just an idea about Abu Huraira. Let's go back and start with our second hadith. Hadith Jabir ibn Abdullah. The Prophet ﷺ said, إن الله لا يقبل من العمل إلا ما كان خالصا وابتغي به وجهه. Narrated that the Prophet ﷺ had said, indeed, Allah does not accept any action unless it is sincere and aimed at his face. At his face, at Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's face. What does that mean? This is a general statement. Allah does not accept any action in where لا يقبل الله من العمل, any action that doesn't have a good intention. Basically, there's no way that the person is going to be getting rewarded for it. إلا ما كان خالصا وابتغي به وجهه. So what does that mean? Only the actions إن الله لا يقبل من العمل إلا ما كان خالصا, that that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would only accept the deeds only if they are sincere and they had intended that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would basically give them the reward for it. Let's move on with another hadith. إذا قام أحدكم إلى الصلاة فإنه يناجي ربه فلينظر كيف يناجي ربه. If any of you attempt to go to prayer, then إذا قام أحدكم إلى الصلاة, the Messenger of Allah said, when one of you stands for prayer, he is in conversation with his Lord, so let him look to know how he converses with him. Ya salam. To look how he converses with him. إذا قام أحدكم إلى الصلاة فإنه يناجي ربه فلينظر كيف يناجي ربه. Let's move on. عن أبي موسى قال جاء رجل إلى النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم فقال يا رسول الله ما القتال في سبيل الله فإن أحدنا يقاتل غضبا ويقاتل حمية فرفع إليه رأسه. قال وما رفع إليه رأسه إلا أنه كان قائما فقال من قاتل لتكون كلمة الله هي العليا فهو في سبيل الله عز وجل. Let's see what happened. The Prophet ﷺ got a man coming over to him, and he said, "O Prophet of Allah, what does it mean to fight for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala?" For different people would basically fight because of anger. Another group would fight because of al-hamiyya, because they're not on your chapter in dealing or on your chapter. So the Prophet ﷺ, sorry about that. So you could see that some were basically coming to fight not for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but they were fighting for the sake of their own selves, basically because of anger. Another one might fight for the sake of their tribe. Another one might fight for different sakes, perhaps to get the booty. So the Prophet ﷺ had explained when he had lifted his head up, when that man asked, well, which one is going to get rewarded for it? So the Prophet ﷺ raised his head and he was sitting down and he said, whoever fights for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in order to elevate the word of Allah, that is basically what is considered for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Let's go right there in where Abu Dharr had narrated that أن ناسا من أصحاب النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قالوا للنبي يا رسول الله ذهب أهل الدثور بالأجور يصلون كما نصلي ويصومون كما نصوم ويتصدقون بفضول أموالهم قال أوليس قد جعل لكم ما تصدقون إن بكل تسبيحة صدقة وكل تكبيرة صدقة وكل تحميدة صدقة وكل تهليلة صدقة وأمر بالمعروف صدقة ونهي عن منكر صدقة وفي بضع أحدكم صدقة قالوا يا رسول الله أيأتي أحدنا شهوته ويكون له فيها أجر قال أرأيتم لو وضعها في حرام أكان عليه فيها وزر فكذلك وضعها في الحلال كان له أجر. What happened? A group from the companions, the Sahaba, they went to the Prophet ﷺ and they said, O Prophet of Allah, the ones that are rich, they've got all the gold and they basically had taken all the good deeds. They would pray like us, they would fast like us, and they have something extra. They are capable of donating with what is extra. In other words, they had $1 million, they only donated 5,000, but they still had a lot. But for us, we would donate, and that's already half our money right there. So what should we do? The Prophet ﷺ said, أَوَلَيْسَ قَدْ جَعَلَ لَكُمْ مَا تَصَدَّقُونَ? Didn't he give you anything? Or he had given you this offer in where what you could donate with. إِنَّ بِكُلِّ تَسْبِيحَةٍ صَدَقَةٍ. Every single time you would say Subhanallah walhamdulillah, that would be a sadaqah. And for every takbirah, every time you would say takbirat al-ihram, that would, or takbirah, Allahu Akbar, that would be a sadaqah. That would be equivalent to giving a donation. وَكُلِّ تَحْمِيدَةٍ صَدَقَةٍ. And for every alhamdulillah you would say is basically a sadaqah you would give. وَكُلِّ تَهْلِيلَةٍ صَدَقَةٍ. These are abbreviations. So this is alhamdulillah, this is Allahu Akbar, this is subhanallah, this is كُلِّ تَهْلِيلَةٍ صَدَقَةٍ. And every time you would say La ilaha illallah, you would basically be considered that you had given a sadaqah. وَأَمْرٌ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ صَدَقَةٍ. Ordering for what is good is also sadaqah. وَنَهْيٌ عَنْ مُنْكَرٍ صَدَقَةٍ. Forbidding what is wrong and what is evil is also sadaqah, also a good deed. And even if the man were to basically be intimate with his wife, or the wife be intimate with her husband, that would be a sadaqah, even if she didn't feel like it. So what the Sahaba were confused and said, would we basically be getting our lust fulfilled and at the same time they would get the reward for it. How was that? So the Prophet ﷺ responded to them, do you see if this person had put it for other than the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, would they be receiving al-wizr? Would they be receiving and getting the bad deed? So the Prophet ﷺ said, well, if he were to put it in something that is haram, he would have gotten a bad deed. But that's the same thing. Just to put it in something halal, you would basically get the good deed for it. So this is just really quick, and we're just seeing those ahadith, and inshallah, I will inshallah continue 2 more ahadith, and I'll let you comment. Let's see. Hadith ibn Abbas, that the Prophet ﷺ actually said, إن الله كتب الحسنات والسيئات ثم بين ذلك فمن هم بحسنة فلم يعملها كتبت له حسنة وإن هم بها فعملها كتبت له 10 حسنات ومن هم بسيئة فلم يعملها لم تكتب عليه وإنما هم بها فعملها كتبت عليه سيئة واحدة. Let's see, that the Prophet ﷺ had said, Allah has recorded the good deeds and the bad deeds. Then he explained, if someone intends to do good but does not do it, it will be recorded as one good idea. And if he intends and does not do it, it will be recorded against him. And if he intends and does not do it, it will be recorded as one bad deed. All right, we'll stop right there because you could say that there's so much to come. If there are any questions or comments, I'd be happy to listen to them. All right. I guess no one is interested in saying anything. What we'll do, inshallah, we will stop right here, and inshallah, we will continue our tafsir class in an hour, inshallah. And in the meantime, we will be always doing, remember, we'll always be doing our hadith Friday at 9 a.m. Minneapolis time. So basically 2 hours from now. So stay tuned. We've got a lot to learn. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نستغفرك ونتوب إليك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت. Go ahead, Rihab. You want to say something, dear?
Yes, Sheikha. Maybe I mixed up, but I think we're Thursday. Well, like, I mean, I thought the class was gonna be on Friday, but we're Thursday. As it's your Friday, I think. Is it
Noura, did I do
possible?
the right thing? So what was I supposed? So the class was supposed to be tomorrow, not today?
Well, I'm not sure, but this is what I understood.
I think
I
you're right and I'm wrong. But Noura
I
didn't comment anything. She was supposed to tell me. I have no idea.
oh,
You know what? That would be catastrophic.
why no?
No, you should have said something in the beginning. Let's see, hold on.
Oh no, because I'm confused too, honestly. I am
Oh,
not sure of all the time.
Allah yahdiki, now you said it. I think you're right. We could always do another class tomorrow. I'm okay with that.
I'm okay with that too. Alhamdulillah.
All
More,
right, inshallah, inshallah. We'll also do the class tomorrow, inshallah.
inshallah. Okay.
Inshallah. All right. All right. Okay, inshallah. See you tomorrow. Assalamu alaikum. Subhanakallah wa bihamdika nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant.